one of the main contributing factors was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie at Sarajevo in June 1914. This event led to the so-called July Crisis. The political situation began to spiral out of control. June 28th, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot by Gavrilo Princip, a Serb nationalist. The Austrians saw the murder as a much-needed pretext to crush Serbia. July the 5th, Kaiser Wilhelm II assured Austria of Germany's support against Serbia. July 23rd, Austria presented Serbia with an ultimatum. She was given 48 hours to reply. The Serbs agreed to all of the demands, bar one. July 28th, Austria rejected the Serbian reply and declared war. The Russians ordered a partial mobilization of their troops in defense of Serbia. July 29th, the Austrians shelled Belgrade. July 30th, Russia ordered general mobilization. The crisis escalated, British mediation failed. July 31st, the Germans presented an ultimatum to Russia to halt her mobilization. She also presented one to France, asking her to stay neutral and to hand over border fortresses. The Germans knew the French wouldn't agree to this. August the 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. France ordered general mobilization. August the 2nd, Germany demanded from the Belgians the right to send troops through their country. It was refused. August the 3rd, Germany declared war on France, and despite the protestations, its troops did enter Belgium. Britain sent an ultimatum to the Germans calling for them to withdraw. There was no response. And so, on the 4th of August 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. The Great War had begun.
They thought it would all be over by Christmas, but it was 4 long years before the war to end all wars would finish. Millions of people would be killed and injured. For countless others, life would never be the same. The armistice was signed to become effective at 11 a.m. on November the 11th, 1918. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. A brittle, fragile peace came to a troubled world. The British lion lay at peace within his island lair, when all at once the bugle rang, its war notes pierced the air. The British lion wanted peace, but Germany said no. So to defend our island home, to war we had to go. When war was declared against Germany on the 4th of August 1914, a mood of intense patriotism and confidence broke out among the people of Britain. Reservists were called back to the colours, and men flocked in their thousands to enlist in the army and navy. In Wales, the general feeling was to enlist, not so much to fight for England, more for Britain and the Empire. And consequently, the military units in Wales at the time, the South Wales Borderers, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, the Welsh Regiment and the Monmouthshire Regiment all accepted new recruits. The Welsh were on their way to war. It was Lord Kitchener, the recently appointed Secretary of State for War, who changed the pattern. He was one of only a few who realised that the conflict could go on for 3 or 4 years. How right he was. At the end of August 1914, he called for volunteers to form a new army, to give extra weight to the regular armed forces.
Your country needs you. In 1914, 54 million copies of that poster were printed. The slogan and the image is memorable, and it worked. Men came forth not in their thousands, but in their hundreds of thousands. 750,000 men came from forward in the first month alone. Charles Street in Greenhill, Swansea had just 39 houses, from which 30 men signed up. Proud wives and uncomprehending children were left behind. In what was then a revolutionary move, local influential politicians, union leaders, civic leaders, sportsmen and academics encouraged recruitment. In Wales, they used Welsh as well as English for this. They promoted the idea that by joining up, a man would enjoy adventure and see a bit of the world. Friends were encouraged to enlist and serve together in units that became known as the Pals Battalions. The poet Rupert Brooke famously wrote,
"Don't lag, follow your flag."
Every soldier sent to the Western Front was given a pamphlet signed by Lord Kitchener, warning of the perils of French wine and of French women. The recruiting officers could hardly cope with the numbers coming forward. In Bridge Ferry, almost every man of eligible age joined up, and the Tylerstown Silver Band joined en bloc. Ideas of nationhood were emerging. There was a growing sensitivity to being Welsh, and in a rousing speech, Lloyd George called for the formation of a separate Welsh army. He reminded the Welsh people of their military tradition, with the decisive factor being the plight of Belgium, a small country like Wales facing aggression from a powerful, bullying neighbour. He said that the war was being fought on behalf of 5'5" nations. Clever words. In Swansea, the mayor of the town, Thomas Taliesin Corker, led the formation of the Swansea Pals. They assembled outside the George in Mumbles, and crowds cheered as they paraded through the town. Amongst the recruits was Corker's son Frank, marching proudly to his death.
In Cardiff, there was a rush to join the new 11th Battalion of the Welsh Regiment, known as the Cardiff Pals Commercial Battalion. Businessmen, coal miners, dockers and teachers all signed up. It was the most cosmopolitan of units. To begin with, they had no uniforms and not enough rifles to go around, so they used broom handles, and most of them continued to live at home, travelling into Maindy Barracks each day. There they would drill and march, and, for a while at least, happily play at being soldiers. Then, on the 14th of September, the Cardiff Pals marched to the railway station. Hundreds lined the streets to see them go. And despite the fact that British soldiers were already fighting and dying in the various theatres of war, the Cardiff Pals went only as far as Lewes in Sussex. There they continued training. For most of the men it was like a Boy Scout camp, fun and certainly different from normal life. Worse, much worse, was to come.
A few weeks later, as a direct result of Lloyd George's speech, the Lord Mayor of Cardiff was called upon to raise a battalion for a new Welsh Army Corps. He gave his enthusiastic support and succeeded in enlisting 1,000 young Welshmen in 8 weeks. It was by no means an exclusively Cardiff battalion, although it did have strong connections with the city. A professional soldier, Captain Frank Gaskell, who had already experienced action at the front, was at home in Cardiff, recovering from an injury. He was invited to command the battalion and accepted with alacrity. They were given a few days to sort out their affairs before travelling by rail to Porthcawl, where they were billeted in an army camp. Gaskell had links with Porthcawl. He lived at one time in Esplanade Avenue, so that's why he chose the town for initial training. The officers, they stayed in houses at a cost of 23 shillings and 4p per man per week. One soldier wrote,
"We are staying in the best of Porthcawl's houses. We receive the best possible food and sleep in beds fit for any gentleman to sleep in."
After Porthcawl, they travelled to Colwyn Bay for an 8-month stay, before moving to Winchester. There was just time, in late November 1915, for a final emotional visit to Cardiff, which included a parade at the Arms Park before the battalion left, marching proudly out of Cardiff Castle on the 4th of December for France, where it had a torrid time.
In its first week on the Western Front, over 50 men were killed, including its commanding officer, Frank Gasson. At Mametz Wood, there were over 450 casualties, and over 150 were killed. The war effort needed more and more recruits. Men between the ages of 18 and 41 were drafted into uniform, initially through cajoling and after March the 2nd, 1916, by conscription. Hundreds more who were younger or older would travel to all their local recruitment stations trying to get accepted. The upper age was actually raised to 51 in 1918. The war effort was calling for 35,000 recruits a week. So quite often a blind eye was turned regarding age, not least because the recruiters were getting paid for every man they signed up. Research now shows the oldest British military casualty was 68, and as many as 1 in 3 sailors of the Royal Navy was underage, due to illiteracy, lost birth records, or sometimes because birth certificates never existed. It's hard to calculate how many underage boys from Wales joined the ranks of the military, but it's estimated that numbers ran into hundreds.
Coal miner's son, Christopher Llewellyn from the Rhondda, was turned down several times at his local recruiting station in Pontypridd because he looked about 14. The records now show that he was actually 12. He even had a letter from his mother Ruth in Parry Street, Tylerstown, encouraging the army to take him if they could find a uniform small enough.
Charlie Harrison was another teenager who enlisted early. The 15-year-old from Cardiff had a tough time. He initially joined the Welsh Cyclist Regiment before transferring to the Machine Gun Corps in 1916. He was sent home with shell shock and trench fever in 1917, but went back to France where he suffered gas poisoning. But he survived the war.
Eddie Hookway from Penarth was just 15 when he enlisted with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. He'd taken part in 2 fierce battles before he was 17 years old. By rights, he should have been 19 before he saw any action. But sadly, he never reached that age, because he died in 1917, in August. At the exact time he was killed, his mother Mary, back at home in Penarth, claimed she dreamt of him getting shot and dying.
Surprisingly, a few females masquerading as men succeeded in joining up and serving on the front line. The most famous was Dorothy Lawrence, who later wrote of her exploits. It was quite extraordinary because being a frontline soldier in battle was strictly a male preserve. How the women got through the medical and how they faced the challenges of military life amongst the men, we can but imagine. Women were, nevertheless, vital to Britain's survival, not least in the drive for new recruits. They were asked to persuade their husbands, sweethearts, brothers and sons to join them. With more and more men getting killed in battle, the military did eventually begin to recruit women over the age of 20, through the medium of English and Welsh. They were never to fight in the trenches. They were needed to offer support either at home or well behind the front line, by nursing, cooking, moving supplies, dealing with mail, and doing general clerical work. Few of those that served are remembered. But in an alcove in Yorkminster, an unobtrusive memorial commemorates the death of women in military service, including those killed in World War I. Wooden panels list the names of those that gave their lives.
These words are by Frederick Niven. Their rifles all they set aside, one impulse to obey. 'Twas just the men on either side, just men on Christmas Day. The war was still in its infancy as the autumn of 1914 turned to winter. On the Western Front, the worsening of the situation and the passing of days into weeks was proof, if any were needed, that the war would not be over by Christmas. On the 7th of December, Pope Benedict XV had proposed an official truce of God, in which all hostilities would cease over the Christmas period. The authorities rejected the idea, but were keen to maintain morale and bring at least some festive cheer to those at the front. Throughout the month of December, almost 500,000 parcels and 2.5 million letters were sent out to the British soldiers. King George V sent a card, and his daughter Princess Mary lent her name to a fund which sent a small brass box of gifts, including tobacco or writing sets, to every serving man. Newspapers carried advertisements for funds and for all manner of gifts and comforts to be sent. The Wincarnis Drinks Company pledged to send every man a French phrase book. The public responded magnificently. There was a similar flow of goods to the German soldiers. The Duke of Württemberg distributed gifts of cigarettes and a photograph of himself, whilst the Kaiser's son, Crown Prince Wilhelm of Prussia, sent a commemorative pipe bearing his image. The German Army's High Command sent gift boxes to the soldiers containing miniature Christmas trees and festive wreaths. Christmas Eve 1914 turned out to be a clear, moonlit night. The damp weather had given way to cold, and a festive frost settled across the trenches of the Western Front. At dusk, candles were lit by both sides, and the little Christmas trees went up along parts of the German line. In the gathering darkness, the soldiers of both sides, cold, uncomfortable, frightened, and miles away from their homes, families, and loved ones, began singing Christmas carols. The next morning was the first Christmas Day of the Great War. Along parts of the front, soldiers responded to the events of Christmas Eve by tentatively emerging from their trenches. They exchanged greetings and even gifts. Apart from anything, it provided both sides with the opportunity to leave the damp of the trenches and tend to the dead and wounded of no man's land. There wasn't one single organised football match between German and British soldiers. That's a nice story. Undoubtedly, there were some small-scale kickabouts, but this was just one of many different activities men took the opportunity to enjoy. A number of soldiers' accounts comment that in the areas where hostilities stopped, even only on this one day, they were able to hear birdsong, a very welcome change to the incessant roar of gunfire and artillery. Possibly the finest account of the Christmas truce was written by a Welshman whose pen name was Frank Richards. His real name was Francis Philip Woodruff. This is how Frank Richards described the events of Christmas Day 1914 in the trenches of the Western Front, somewhere in France.
We stuck up a board with a Merry Christmas on it. The enemy had stuck up a similar one. Two of our men threw their equipment off and jumped on the parapet with their hands above their heads. Two of the Germans did the same and commenced to walk into no man's land. Our two men went out to meet them. They met and shook hands, and then we all got out of the trench. Buffalo Bill, our company commander, endeavoured to prevent it, but he was too late. The whole of the company was out, and so were the Germans. He had to accept the situation. So he and the other company officers climbed out too. We and the Germans met in the middle of no man's land. Their officers were also now out, and our officers exchanged greetings with them. Oh, we mucked in all day with one another. They were Saxons, see, and some of them could speak English. By the look of them, their trenches were in as bad a state as our own. We didn't allow them into our trench, mind, and they didn't allow us in theirs. The German company commander asked Buffalo Bill if he would accept a couple of barrels of beer, and assured him that they would not make his men drunk, and they had plenty of it. So he accepted the offer with thanks, and a couple of their men rolled the barrels over and we took them into our trench. Buffalo Bill presented them with a plum pudding. A German officer sent one of his men back to the trench, and he appeared shortly after, carrying a tray with a bottle and glasses on it.
There, in the middle of the mud and carnage that was no man's land, on that first Christmas day of the Great War, the soldiers of both sides clinked glasses and drank one another's health.
The officers came to an understanding that the unofficial truce would end at midnight. At dusk we went back to our respective trenches. The 2 barrels of beer were drunk, and the German officer was right. If it was possible for a man to have drunk the 2 barrels himself, he would have bursted before he got drunk. French beer was rotten stuff. Midnight came and there'd been no firing. And during the whole of Boxing Day we didn't fire a shot, and they the same. One of them men shouted across to us,
"Hey, Tommy, you enjoys the beer, yeah?"
We shouted back and told him it was very weak, but that we were grateful for it. We were conversing off and on like that during the whole of the day, until another battalion came to relieve us at dusk.
Belgian, Indian and French troops who witnessed these episodes of fraternization were at best puzzled, and at worst angry that British troops were being friendly towards the Germans. Whereas there was little in the German press, the British papers were full of reports of these small-scale ceasefires. The British High Command feared that men would now question the war, and that this would lead to mutiny. They issued the directive that informal truces with the enemy were to cease, and any soldier found to have initiated one would be tried by court-martial. Some soldiers along the front had cameras, and the High Command were annoyed that photographs of the truce appeared in the press. Newspapers suddenly became hungry for any and all pictures from the front, and started offering ridiculous sums of money, up to £2,000 for the best one. The High Command consequently stepped up the ban on cameras, afraid that soldiers would concentrate on taking photographs rather than fighting. Any soldier caught with a camera could be court-martialed or sent to prison with hard labour, and this did happen. Some sources claim that in spite of the official attempts to crack down, there was a second, shorter truce at Christmas 1915 involving the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. There was little, if any, attempt at a truce in 1916, and none whatsoever in 1917. The guns out there are roaring fast. The bullets fly like rain. The aeroplanes are curveting. They go and come again. The bombs talk loud, the mines crash out. No trench their might withstands. Who helped them all to do their job? The girls with the yellow hands.
In the first few months of the war, there was a heady rush to the colours, and there was also a concerted effort by the government to target women into encouraging, coercing, and indeed humiliating men into enlisting. Mothers, wives and sweethearts were drawn into the recruiting campaign. Duty and patriotism were the priorities. Sacrifice and death were yet to be a consideration. Slogans appeared in the press, such as,
"Is your best boy wearing khaki? If not, don't you think he should be?
and
If your young man neglects his duty to his king and country, the time may come when he will neglect you."
newspapers also encouraged men to recruit women to recruit men. A letter dated the 29th of August, 1914 to the Times reminded every British girl that she would
Give good help to her country by shunning a man, be he lover, brother or friend, a man who did not take up arms.
On the 4th of September 1914, there was an appeal to the women of Britain, telling them that if any of them were wondering,
well, what can I do?
the answer was simple.
We want your men, your sweethearts, your brothers, your sons, your friends. Will you use your influence so that they respond, one and all?
Also,
Mothers, your sons cannot stand aside any longer. You, his mother, will be ashamed to look all the brave British men and women in the face.
in December 1914, the Contemporary Review advised girls to
Cut the acquaintance of any sweetheart not in khaki.
On the 8th of July 1915, Ethel M. informed Jack G. via a letter in the Times,
If you are not in khaki by the 20th, I will cut you dead.
Alas, we'll never know what's happened to Jack and to Ethel.
It was breakfast time on December the 16th, 1914. Under the cover of the wintry darkness, German battleships had crossed the North Sea and shelled the coastal towns of Whitby, Hartlepool and Scarborough, killing 122 and injuring 450 civilian men, women and children. As a result of the bombardment, two sisters, Annie and Florence Kay, were the first female civilians to be killed by enemy action on British soil. It's hard now to appreciate the shock that was caused by these deaths. Suddenly, things changed. Women had become victims. The war machine was cranking into action, and women's lives were becoming inexorably entwined.
The war was beginning to make huge demands. Women were taking over jobs that had always been a male preserve. For instance, back in 1912, the services ordered 245,000 pairs of boots, 250,000 jackets, and 43,000 greatcoats. But in 1914, the order was for 6.5 million pairs of boots, 5.5 million jackets, and 1.5 million greatcoats. 12 million letters a week were collected and delivered to the front. These and other wartime demands took some fulfilling. Women played their part, sometimes by working 12-hour shifts in heavy industry. It was dirty, it was noisy, and it was dangerous. A large proportion of the British military weapons were made here in Wales, mostly by women, that became known as munitionettes. In a tribute to these brave workers, the French Field Marshal Joffre famously said,
If the women in the factories had stopped work for 20 minutes, the Allies would have lost the war.
Before the war, the majority of women stayed at home or worked in domestic service. They never worked in a factory before. Most of them were young and they found the whole thing strangely liberating. They had set hours, set routines, and they were earning money, which was spent on having a good time. They formed sports teams together. They socialised together. They were so buoyant and happy that people used to complain that they filled the pavement walking out arm in arm. Some of them even went into public houses. They could go off after work, get dressed up nicely in their new coats and knee-high leather boots.
They deserve to, because not so well reported were the appalling and terrible accidents. Health and safety was non-existent. Gabriella West, a worker at a munitions factory in Pembray, wrote in her diary,
"Beef in the court out affects some of the girls terribly. It gives them headaches, hysteria, and sometimes makes them unconscious."
Censorship blanked out many of the incidents in which the munitionettes were killed or horribly maimed. Explosions and accidents occurred regularly, and the chemical caused many of them ill health for life. Sometimes, as we heard, it even turned their skin and their hair yellow.
Middle-class women did their bit, with Margaret Lloyd George, the Prime Minister's wife, leading the way. There were huge amounts of charity work to do, hosting tea parties to raise money, and many of these lady volunteers, such as Sisters Gwendolyn and Margaret Davis from Gregunnog, paid their own way, used their own funds to buy food, drinks, cigarettes for the troops. Many women did sterling work as volunteer nurses in Britain and in Europe, and not only nursing humans. Dozens of animal hospitals were also set up, behind the lines where qualified vets and staff treated injured animals, mostly horses.
Although terrible things were happening in the world at this time, there were some nice stories and smiles in the face of adversity. For example,
Lottie Davis from Caerphilly worked as a volunteer nurse. One day, a young Cockney soldier who'd been wounded in the Somme was brought in for treatment. A week or so later, they rode off together into the sunset on his motorbike, and they lived happily as man and wife for over 50 years.
Thousands of women were called upon to join the Land Army, working in the fields and farms all over Britain. The war was making huge, ever-increasing demands of farmers and landowners. They had to be as productive as possible. With the menfolk fighting for king and country, women were needed and expected to till the soil, plant the crops, tend to livestock and to gather in the harvest. Every piece of suitable land was taken up and used for agriculture. It was heavy, hard and demanding work, to which some girls who had been born and raised in the country were accustomed. But for those who joined from the towns and cities, it was challenging. The Land Army was a young girl's game, albeit a generally happy and a satisfying one.
Things about being in the Land Army was that the girls got to wear trousers, much to the annoyance of the government. This was considered in some circles to be quite shocking, even to the extent of being labelled cross-dressing.
feminists had campaigned for female police officers for years. And in 1916, lo and behold, it happened.
But there was no training. They were just given a uniform and their main role was in directing people. When the war ended, the Welsh Women's Police Force was immediately disbanded, and it was decades before it was re-established.
For some reason, the Welsh authorities were fearful of an outbreak of what was called khaki fever.
That's the supposedly overwhelming attraction felt by young women towards a man in uniform.
And as a result, the young women in Wales were policed under the Defence of the Realm Act, and those who were caught committing indecent acts were arrested. Women in Cardiff were placed under curfew, and in Swansea one councillor called the town
an absolute hotbed of sexual activity between the young women and visiting sailors.
The Swansea Women's Citizens Union launched a purity crusade in an attempt to
stem the tide of immorality sweeping over the town. Although we may smile wryly at some of these things 100 years on, the stories of the difficulties and hardships faced by the women with families looked after won't ever make easy listening. Women went to extraordinary efforts to keep things going through bitter winters, shortages of food and bleak news. The nation handed out pitiful separation allowances and monitored the way that they were spent, unhesitatingly withdrawing them if they felt that they were incorrectly used. Little is heard of the widows and single mothers who were forced into workhouses and had to put their children up for adoption. The First World War is still seen through the eyes, male eyes, and probably always will be. However, it would not have been won without the efforts of millions of women who, in the words of the famous song, keep the home fires burning.
There were wartime rules and regulations that came into force, and they had to be adhered to. Some of these were particularly relevant to women. For example, it was considered bad form to dress extravagantly in times of such trouble and austerity. In the kitchen, waste was frowned upon. Restrictions on food production eventually led to the introduction of rationing. Fines were issued for making white flour instead of whole wheat, and allowing rats to invade stores was heavily punished. Throwing rice at weddings was banned, as was feeding pigeons or ducks in the park.
In London, it was forbidden to whistle for taxis in case the sound was mistaken for an air raid warning. It was also forbidden to loiter near bridges and tunnels.
In mainland Europe, the womenfolk faced unusual challenges. The lady barber in Vermouth gave the Allied troops haircuts. She was taking the place of her husband, who was away in the French army. When asked how she would like it when the war was over and her husband comes back, she said,
"All the women will continue to work. The men will rest all day. There will not be enough men to go around."
She was told that the women will have to share and share alike. She thought, and then added knowingly,
"I will get my share."
Ooh la la.
The Great War was proving to be more terrible and more horrific than anything experienced to date. The effects were being felt all over the world. We've heard how the gung-ho attitude, so widespread at the outset, embroiled an entire generation in the conflict. The extraordinary events of Christmas 1914 are still spoken about 100 years later, even though the Great War has now passed from living memory. The role of women changed so much that nothing was ever to be the same. There are still avenues to explore, including the lighter side, stories of outstanding bravery, the amazing tales of the tunnels at the front, and the heart-wrenching letters between serving soldiers and their loved ones. The legacy of the war to end all wars still prevails. We'll discover more